Well, hello, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining us for the Dare Dallas webinar today. First of all, thank you ever so much to everyone that joined us last week for myself and Jonathan talking about Winston Churchill. I'm sure you agree it was one of the most fascinating talks I think we've had in a really long time, and Jonathan's knowledge on the subject was just incredible, and I had a thoroughly good time speaking to Jonathan, and hopefully he did with me. And strangely enough, there's going to be a bit of a role reversal in a couple of weeks, because Jonathan is actually going to be interviewing me about guitars and vintage musical instruments, which I think is going to be quite interesting. Well, if you like that kind of thing, it certainly is. Now, another one of the most interesting webinars that we've done in recent weeks was actually with Jenny Knott about hallmarks, and again, really good reaction, thoroughly good response. Had a lot of nice comments about it, and at the time there were a lot of questions kind of bouncing around about silver, and it wasn't a silver webinar, it was a hallmarks webinar, so we decided we would actually do one on silver and what's going on in the silver market at the moment. So first of all, Jenny Knott, hello, how are you?
I'm very well, Alistair, very well indeed, thank you. I can even see rays of sunshine behind me, so that is I think that augurs well for today, and maybe summer's on its way.
Let's hope so. Let's hope so. So, Jenny, the subject matter for today, obviously, is silver. It's a very broad thing to discuss. Yeah. But how did you get into silver, and what kind of sparked your love for it?
I really truly wish that I had some great story about how I had picked up my grandmother's silverback mirror, and then that sparked my love of silver. What actually happened, it's so prosaic, I'm almost embarrassed to tell this story. I had decided when I was at university I wanted to be an English teacher, but my father was a schoolmaster, and I had grown up in a boys' boarding school, so I thought it might be a good idea to do something different before I went to be a teacher. And in one of my university holidays, I had managed to persuade Bonhams to give me a job. And when I finished that period in the summer, they said, if you ever want a job, come back. So that was too tempting an offer to turn down. So when I graduated, I was lucky enough to walk straight into a job in the ceramics department, which is where they had a vacancy. And I apologise greatly to Eric Knowles, who many of you will know from the Roadshow and many other television appearances, and his wide knowledge. He is an absolutely delightful and knowledgeable man, but ceramics just wasn't my bag. And after, I mean, apart from anything else, I'm really clumsy, so I just spent my whole life as a bag of nerves. So after a few weeks, a vacancy came up in the silver department, and I thought, that looks to me to be more interesting. So it wasn't initially a massive love of silver. I thought that it would just be a better fit than ceramics. But I don't want people to feel that's disappointing, because what happened then, and I don't know how you started, but what happened was I went into that department and I realized I really would love this subject. And back in the day, I like our audience to visualize, in my first day in the silver department, we had a massive silver room where all the silver for the next silver sale would come. So there'd be monthly silver sales, say 400 lots of just pieces of silver. And my job on day one was to match the piece of silver with its catalogue description and lot number. And I can tell you, when you do that, you spend a year working out, well, what's a double scroll handle and what's a flying scroll handle? Reading all these terms and then correlating the two. These days it's different. We have stock, we barcode things. It's a piece of cake these days. But then it was the handling of silver day in, day out, literally hundreds of pieces. And the more I handled it, the more I learned about it, the more I sort of, I have such a sense, I still do, of the history of things. Even then, so I was probably a bit unusual in my 20s, and I started collecting bits and pieces, particularly flatware, which is knives and forks, things you eat with. And I particularly love collecting basting spoons. I have a huge collection of basting spoons, which I jokingly said the other day. I mean, we have basting spoons in our family because a tablespoon doesn't really cut it. We're really greedy. We need a big long one. And I would handle these spoons and have this, and most of mine are sort of late 1800s, early 1900s, and had this huge sense that this spoon was made and has been used and handled for hundreds of years and has well outlived its maker and the generations of people that have owned it. And I think silver's beautiful, but I just love the history, and I love the social history. I mean, I know for definite during the course of this webinar, we will talk about, I mean, we've loosely called it what's hot and what's not, but silver coming in and out of fashion. And I love the correlation of how silver works in history. So, I mean, an obvious, for example, you will come across this, is when you had flatware, I sort of loosely said knives and forks. I should have said spoons and forks, because you and I both know that in the 18th and early 19th century, knives never came with your canteen, and they were very expensive and rare. So knives had their own knife boxes. I mean, and they will have gone off the boil a little bit, but sort of a knife box, a beautiful wooden knife box, inlaid knife box from, let's say, 1790, 1800. I mean, back in the day, that could have made £1,000 in and of itself, but the knives were separate. The knives, they were filled with pitch. They didn't last in the same way. So you never, ever had, the knives weren't at that stage ever bought with the flatware. And I'm taking a very long time to answer your question, but I think you now it's the whole package for me. I just find it fascinating. I don't love every piece of silver I see. I'm sure you would say that as well, but I just love the history, the social history, and the beautiful craftsmanship.
I think for me, silver defines the kind of it's the midpoint between what I love about the historical elements of furniture and the historical elements of furniture and the design and flamboyance of jewellery. So you've kind of got those two aspects in one group of items. And I think you've got so many different makers who had such different interpretations of items. So exactly the same in the fact that, you know, Chippendale, Hepplewhite, whoever making a table would variate that design so much. Exactly the same with you're not going to get a boring kind of pot from Christopher Dresser. You're not going to get a boring bucket from Paul Storr. It's exactly that kind of thing, and it's the design aspect, and it's still these things have uses. And even today, and we'll talk about the market and the fact that it has changed a lot, but a lot of these items still have uses. It's not just a decorative piece. Now, we have seen in the last 30 years, I would say, not a general decline, but obviously the market has changed dramatically. And I think one of the biggest factors in it, from my experience, and I remember not many moons ago, but back in, let's say, 2010, when the scrap value of silver absolutely rocketed, we saw such a huge point where people were literally buying stuff and scrapping it. And there was such a massive loss to the world, really, of some fine silver pieces, because quite simply, when you look at flatware, like you were discussing there wasn't any value in it. And people were taking these things away and taking them to the melters because people just weren't willing to pay. Even good Georgian flatware, the scrap price was worth more.
Well, you're absolutely right. And in our previous webinar, I made the mistake of correlating you and I as having been around this world quite a long time. And I've obviously, due to my great age, been around it a lot longer than you. You are absolutely right. And two things actually correlate there. Number one, the first point you made, which is that silver is both decorative and useful. So, you know, useful like a piece of furniture is useful, but it also has intrinsic value. So there are always people, there is always a market for speculating on the silver price, which brings me to your second point. So you're right, but in about 2010, the price went enormously high. But when I'm talking about our age, you won't remember, you weren't born. I was born, I wasn't working there then, but there was an American oil executive industrialist called Bunker Hunt. Yep. And Bunker, does that ring a bell with you? Bunker Hunt tried in the late 70s to literally corner the silver market, and spent billions, I think somewhere between £2 and £4 billion, he and his brothers, in buying silver. And the silver price in the late 70s, early 80s went from $11 an ounce to $50 an ounce. And exactly what you've just described happened. They were doing this in America, but people were literally scrapping in Georgian salvers, beautiful things. And so eventually the American government intervened, and actually the price, he went bankrupt and the price tanked right back down to $11 an ounce. I mean, for people that are listening today, the pandemic has caused the silver price to, it's just under £20 an ounce at the moment. I'm old fashioned, I still work in ounces. And I think it's fair to say, some things, as our world evolves, in all aspects of our lives, things that were appropriate and we used a lot, we don't use so much. And it's the same with silver. And I think, you know, you and I could run off, what don't we use? I mean, your parents, my parents would have been given a boxed cruet set when they got married. It would have been a lovely gift. We don't use white ground pepper anymore. We want to grind our own peppers. So those sort of pepperettes, no, they have little value. Again, you know, thinking back to the early part of the 20th century, if you were a girl, you might have been given a dressing table set. You know, we've seen them in beautiful case dressing table sets with hairbrushes. You wouldn't put it near your hair now. A clothes brush. Maybe you, a man of such sartorial elegance, still uses a clothes brush, but basically not. And those, they're redundant. The only thing in that sort of set that ever would get used now would be a hand mirror. But similarly, you know, your grandfather would have been given a cigarette case. Well, cigarette-related silver, of which, as you and I know, there is masses. It's redundant now, and it's unlikely that will ever see the light of day in terms of being useful anymore, apart from anything else as a little aside fact for those of you who still smoke, which obviously you shouldn't do, and we don't, Dare Dallas don't condone. But those cigarette cases were made for filterless cigarettes anyway. So even if you are a smoker, yeah. So you're right. So you're absolutely right. There's a tranche of silver which we perhaps shouldn't be too sentimental about. It's had its day. It did what it needed to do then. And I think we have to be accepting of the fact that things change. I mean, I always love it when people sort of repurpose things. So, I mean, nowadays, a lot of silver toaster racks, for example, will be used as letter racks.
Yeah.
Great repurposing. We're always up for repurposing. But for me, I mean, what a shame to have had Georgian salvers, or as you say, flatware, just bunged into the scrap because you could get more for it as scrap than you could as the intrinsic object it is.
Oh, it's shocking, isn't it? But unfortunately, that was the nature of it. And people that work in that kind of market, what they do is they're there to make a profit, and one can't criticize them for that. Now, but there were obviously things that have remained popular in the silver market, and items that are still very, very much of value. Now, I'm going to bring up a photograph. Now, you know a little bit more about the item that this was recently sold, wasn't it? What can you tell us about this specific item? I'm just going to bring this one up now.
Well, I'm putting my glasses on because I want to make sure I tell our audience that give them the right facts. I have a friend, Rupert Slingsby, who runs the silver department at William Wallace, and knowing we were doing this webinar, I rang him to get a view of his view of the auction market, which was very interesting and also somewhat surprising. So you and I both, Alistair, have some auction background. And when we put together a sale, we generally reckon if you add up the lower end of the estimates of the items you've got in, that would give you a fair indication of what your sale might make. This sale took place, the sale where this object was sold took place in April, but it had been laid over because of COVID from November. And there was definitely, Rupert told me, a massive sense of sort of pent up demand in the market because there had been, fairs, silver auctions, not all auctions had stopped, but there was this huge pent up demand. Their lower end estimate for this sale was something just over £500,000. The actual sale made jolly nearly £1 million. And you and I will know how unusual it is to have that kind of discrepancy. And this, to actually get to the question you asked, this ice pail is by a maker called Paul Storr. And most people, even if they don't know a great deal about silver, will have come across the names Paul de la Marie and Paul Storr. Paul Storr was one of the best Regency, early 19th century makers. If you look around any stately home, I mean, I think I'd almost say, Chatsworth, Wadston Manor, Brighton Pavilion, if you look around any property of substance, you will undoubtedly find a piece of Paul Storr silver, and he made across the board. So it might be something, it could be something like a salt, although I would say if you found a Paul Storr salt, it wouldn't be your average little, weedy little salt. It would be a piece with some heft.
Very elaborate.
And very elaborate, probably with cast feet, definitely with a gilded interior. Definitely that, because otherwise the salt would eat away at your silver. But to get back to this item, it's hard to see from the scale. This is actually an ice pail. They called it an ice pail or a wine cooler. I mean, I probably like to think of it as a wine cooler because I think it doesn't take a great leap of imagination to see a bottle of Tattinger sitting quite comfortably in there. But I think what you can see even from this photograph is a sense of quality. So that gadrooned border is going to be heavy gadrooning. That's a cast border. It's obviously, they call the term, they call it coopered, made to look a little bit like a barrel. But this isn't so obvious from the photograph, but the handles, that handle will swing and the hinges on that will be magnificent. So you've therefore got a piece by one of the best makers. It's substantial, and it's just beautifully made in fabulous condition. I mean, we can see that from the photograph. And I'm going to refer to get it quite right. I thought this was interesting in the context of where silver's at. This was bought from William Wallace in 2015 for £16,000. And it sold in April of this year for £26,000.
Gosh, that's quite an increase, isn't it?
It really is quite an increase.
When we think about the silver market from 2016 to the silver market of today, it's not something generally that one would think, oh gosh, that has gone up by that kind of figure in general. So do we think the market is moving towards the more substantial pieces of quality? So, I mean, I say substantial as a wine cooler, it's not a massive piece of silver, but when we think about things like card cases, salts, flatware, it's a relatively large, big piece, isn't it? So do you think the collectors now are moving towards those larger pieces and they're not afraid to spend that kind of figure?
Well, clearly they're not afraid to spend that kind of figure. And I don't know, and nor, quite rightly, would William Wallace tell me whether that was bought privately or in the trade. But either way, it shows there's a really big appetite for quality pieces. And in fact, and I was involved in an auction last week at Dawson's, another auction house in Maidenhead, and there was an enormous Irish épergne. Now, an épergne, so that those who may not know, it's a centerpiece consisting of a central basket and then a sort of framework of arms with lots of other little smaller baskets and dishes on it. It's the kind of thing that would look magnificent in the middle of a huge, a baronial hall or a huge table. I mean, just astonishing. This piece, again, I think we as, the auction house were thinking, well, it's substantial. It was Irish. So again, in our tick box of things that are desirable, Irish particularly, and Scottish silver, always desirable. But it had a few issues. Some of the baskets had little bits of They're pierced sides missing, and it had a patch on the base. So
was it completely silver? Because I know some of
it was completely silver, and it was marked. So the issues were a little bit around condition, which I would normally say beware of condition, because no matter how lovely something is, condition is crucial. But this was sufficient. In answer to your question, this was a very impressive piece. It was Irish. It was, as you've rightly pointed out, all silver, all complete, no replacement bowls. So the estimate was arguably a fairly modest 3 to 500,000. Sorry, excuse me, 3 to 500 would have been ridiculously modest. So it was, the estimate was 3 to 5,000, but it made 12,000. And don't forget, that's the hammer before commissions applied. And I think that shows that, yes, you're right, there is clearly an appetite for big, important pieces and rare pieces, always rare. I mean, anything that is rare, be it rare because the maker's unusual, be it rare because it's Irish, be it rare because it's very early. And I'm always conscious whenever I have a talk like this, or you know, give talks to people, we shouldn't be too parochial. I mean, we need to be outward looking. There are amazing continental pieces of silver, but again, you know, just off of, you know, American silver, Paul Revere. I mean, I love to talk about, fantastic American silversmith. Also, in parenthesis, I love this, also he was the guy that did the ride of Paul Revere to warn the colonial militias that the British were coming. So perhaps there should be no love lost. So he was one in the same chap. But so a silversmith like that, hugely rare. You were talking about something French. I mean, Puy-Faucard, that would be a great French Art Deco maker. And I mean, again, coming closer to home, I will say in my very best Danish accent, Jørgen Jensen. Or as I more usually would say, or we say, George Jensen. Again, I mean, that's for me is a perfect example of a beautiful, something that his pieces are, you know, they are prolific, but the lines are very clean, and again, crossing over, doing the jewellery silver crossover, but very sought after. If you look up George Jensen, recent sale results, they're really impressive. Even for small things, they're impressive.
I think the nature of silver, it's a funny one, and I think there are obviously some designers who liked working with silver more than they did with other things, and especially with Georg Jensen. It was one of those things whereby he used silver as a medium more than he probably used any other material. And even the more modern pieces of his work are making, you know, impressive figures. And obviously, you know, that there's been decades and decades of his work, and, you know, styled after him and things like that, but it's still important items, and they're still making a reasonable amount of money. I'm going to bring up another image, I think from the same sale, actually. Let's have a quick look at this, and I do like this one. What can you know, that lovely floreate scrolling on there?
Yeah, well, again, I'm just going to make sure I'm accurate in what I'm saying about this. So we loosely touched on early silver being sought after. I mean, early rare spoons, provincial marks. There are very specific collectors of this sort of thing. And this is early. This is a Charles II porringer and cover. And this sort of, what you and I would probably describe as chinoiserie decoration. It's so clean and crisp, isn't it? I mean, it's when you can...
For a photograph, normally, despite obviously having very good photographers, you wouldn't be able to pick out those kind of details in as much clarity as you can with
absolutely this. Not. And if people can see, I mean, you've got your very much in the chinoiserie taste, this sort of fruiting foliage, but also the little bird who's obviously off in a hurry somewhere at the base. That's fantastic. And you know, let's bear in mind, that was all hand engraved. I mean,
Yeah.
one of the things I always think about is what people did with what they had available. I mean, you know, nowadays we have, I mean, since the Industrial Revolution, we've been on an upward curve of things that have helped us to mass produce beautiful things. That is all done by hand. And again, if we look, the handles, those lovely double scroll handles, cast
And the finial, I mean, that
yeah,
finial.
that was going there. And the finial, which looks like it's a sort of, it's an unopened bud with those sort of their acanthus leaves, a cast piece of silver. I mean, everything about that smacks of quality. And I also liked this image, and I thought it was useful because you can see, I hope this is right as it seems to people watching, the hallmarks, on the left-hand side of the body of the piece, but also, which is something that we didn't touch on in our hallmarks webinar, but largely because we spoke too much and we forgot, but you can see the hallmarks again on the cover. And that's always interesting to me, that pieces of silver where parts are separate, so they could even be joined by a hinge, but parts are separate, should have hallmarks on each piece. And I mean, so that, every box, you give it a box, that piece is ticking it. And I wanted to say, I've just got, so that piece again, Rupert kindly told me, was auctioned originally, again, by William Wallace in 2014. And it was sold for 13,000. In April when it sold, and this is extraordinary, so only 7 years later, it fetched 31,000.
My word.
Yeah.
How do we even begin to justify why that has happened? It's incredible, isn't it? I mean, both of these pieces I would describe as being commercial entities, though I think they're the type of thing that you could put in any silver gallery, and even retail price of 50, 60 grand, somebody is going to come along and go, that is incredible and I want to own that. And I think that, you know, that is that kind of thing. However, that's a large increase, isn't it?
It's a really large increase, and it's what makes our job challenging at times, because you're right, it is commercial. To my mind, it's also very, very beautiful. I mean, that engraving to me is absolutely exquisite, but as I said, it ticks every other box. But this uplift in value, which is, it's around quality and rarity, but it's nuanced. I don't think, I don't actually know what the estimate for it was going into auction, but I'd venture to say that Rupert and his team will have been very pleased with that as a price.
I would imagine it probably went in with a very similar estimate to what it was bought for back in those days, because that seems to be the norm in this time. But as you say, I think that kind of result on that price is remarkable. And what was the actual height of it? Because a porringer is not actually quite as big as you might imagine.
No, it isn't. It was 19, it is hopefully still 19.5 centimeters high, so not that big. And you wouldn't, and you wouldn't expect a porringer to be a big thing. So, you know, not a big thing, but exquisite and right in every way. I remember in my early days, I used to try and talk to all the dealers that would come or people that would come and view. You know, I thought it'd be a great way of learning and just sort of absorbing their experience and expertise. And I never forgot somebody saying to me once, if something is beautiful and well made and perfect and you love it, spend more than you're comfortable spending. On the other hand, if you see something you think is quite nice, but it's very cheap, but it's got a bit of an issue, leave it. And that, I thought, I mean, probably 25 years ago, somebody said that to me, and I've held that in my mind, that it's always worth spending a little bit more on something that is good and right, and try not to be seduced by a cheap price tag.
It's a cliche, but always spend on quality. And it's, I think, silver is concerned, it's never been more apparent, really, because it's down to the maker, it's down to the quality, it's down to the condition. And I think with silver, it's a really good mixture of all those three items. In many other aspects, in many other areas of antiques, one could say, well, there is one that is more important than the others. But with silver, I think it's the maker, it's the condition, it's the item. You know, there are so many things that they all come into play, and that's why those big kind of figures are achieved. Jenny, we're running out of time a little bit today, but what do you think in terms of where do you see the silver market going? Do you think we're going to be having these huge gulfs that we've still got now, that some of the best pieces are making ridiculous amounts of money, and these cigarette cases, the salts, the button hook sets and things like that still continue falling by the wayside?
Yeah, well, I'm certainly not envisaging using a button hook to put my shoes on or anything else. Or, I mean, it's a funny thing that you say, because you do still get quirky. I was involved in the sale the other day where they had a Victorian skirt pull. So
they're great. No,
And you know,
I was about to say I love a skirt pull, but that's not what I meant.
And you know, frankly, none of us are going to be using a skirt pull to pull our skirts out of the mud, and yet something like that is, you know, it's quirky and it's just novel. And so there's more, you know, no one's going to be using a vinaigrette either. No. I mean, a vinaigrette's been the little sort of boxes with grills and sponges that you used to carry in the street, so you could smell something sweet instead of the unsavory odors that permeated the streets. But so that's a slight anomaly. Little things like that will always have a value. I think as a serious answer to your question, there is a huge body of thought believing that silver is still massively undervalued. So for a long time, people the silver knocked around the £10 an ounce mark for a long time. In 2010, as you rightly pointed out, it went up to about £25 an ounce. It then dropped down, and as we said now, it's just under 20. But there are a huge number of people who think that's massively suppressed, and there are conspiracy theorists saying, you know, it's suppressed by the banks, it's suppressed by the governments. I mean, one of the things that I think is pertinent to this question is silver isn't just used to make objects. Silver is used everywhere, you know, in the automotive industry, in the nuclear industry, masses in medicine, in X-ray machines. I mean, it's a very used commodity, unlike gold, which is, people will now ring up and say, oh, but it is, but largely gold is used to be decorative. Yeah. And silver isn't. So there's a view that the silver price is massively suppressed. I mean, by a factor of 4 or 5 times what it might be. And a lot of people hedge against that. You know, they buy silver. And that is relevant to your question, because obviously if the price of the commodity goes up,
it's dictated by that. Yeah, absolutely.
But I think in terms of the question you meant sort of as a purist, once again, we're looking at those the basic things. So we haven't touched on at all, because this happens every time we do a webinar. We have an enormous scope.
Well, the good thing is there's always time for another webinar.
Yeah. Well, we haven't talked about sort of any arts and crafts silver. So those sort of makers, the Omar Ramsdens, the Liberty, Archibald Knox. I mean, again, hugely collectible. Where do I think that's going? If I was a betting woman, I would bet up. Only up. I mean, Archibald Knox is a good one, just as perhaps a quick something to finish with, because a lot of silver that was made by Archibald Knox for Liberty, or Liberty silver, also it's silver with enamel. You might find an enameled terminal on a spoon, or the decoration will be enamel. Where enamel is incredibly hard, as you and I know, very hard, but also brittle. So once enamel has gone, once it's chipped, it's nice.
Or anything else, really.
Yeah. So pieces, so some, you know, an Archibald, even something like, even something like a Liberty napkin ring, let's say from, I don't know, 1905, a Liberty napkin ring. Now, normally bog standard napkin rings, they're probably slightly in the, everybody's been to IKEA and bought, you know, 200 napkins for £2. So yeah. I can sort of hear the rancor in the store. I'm sure there are people still using napkin rings, but by and large, if you went to an auction now, you could pick up a silver napkin ring for somewhere between £10 and £20, an average one.
If not less, I would say.
If not less.
Generally speaking, the scrap value.
Yeah, exactly. If you, I mean, if you looked, we went away from this, I ventured to say if it was a Liberty napkin ring, it's going to be £200 or £300 for the same item. And although we've got down to the very, very particular, I think that almost encapsulates a lot of what we've said. Is if it's rare, if the maker's there, if it's in great condition, I mean, not quite the sky's the limit, but that is where for me, that is where the market is headed. I think we will jettison the sort of detritus of earlier ages, and it probably will become more rarefied. I mean, what I should say, which we always say, is if I had my crystal ball, I would be, once again, I'll say, we would be doing this webinar from some, you know, some sandy shore on a gorgeous island.
Indeed, indeed. Jenny, it's been an absolute pleasure yet again chatting to you about this, and obviously a subject that you're very passionate about, and we can obviously see that, and it's been a lovely talk again. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you ever so much for joining us. We really do appreciate you joining us for these chats. Please do follow us and obviously get in touch via LinkedIn. And if there are any other items that you'd really like us to talk about, please get in touch, and we're more than happy to have a look and see if we can do something on a bit more specifics. So in the interim, we'll see you next week, and take care. And thank you very much to Jenny once again.
Well, thank you very much, Alison. Like I say, you know, I could run on for ages on this subject, but it's really lovely to speak with a fellow enthusiast. I've really enjoyed it.
Good. Ladies and gentlemen, a pleasure as always. Take care. Bye-bye.